what we're going to be going over here is direct materials variance analysis, and we're going to look at it in terms of a graph here to determine these different variances for our direct materials. But when we're talking about variance analysis, this is where we're looking to compare our actual results for the period here versus some budgeted performance that we set here for the period. Okay, so when we're talking about our variance analysis, really we're dealing with three different budgets or three different amounts that we have to determine here. So we first start with our static amount, or that's the standard amount that we allow here for, in this case, our direct materials here. And we establish that at the beginning of the period, and that's simply taking some budgeted quantity times some budgeted price. So that sets up our static or our standard amount, and usually be taken off some master budget or something of that, planning budget or some standard amount that we have set aside for our products. And then at the end of the period, this is where we can determine our actual results. And that's simply taking the actual quantity times some actual price. So that gives us our actual results for the period. Now, knowing our actual results, again, these are determined at the end of the period, and then knowing what our static or standard amount that we budgeted at the beginning of the period, now we can set up what we call our flexible budget. And that's simply taking the actual quantity from our actual results here times the budgeted price. And the budgeted price is coming from our static or our standard amount. So actual quantity from our actual results, budgeted price from our static budget, that equals our flexible budget. So knowing these three amounts, now we can determine our different variances between our actual, flexible, and static or standard amounts. So what we're going to have to deal with here is we're going to have a purchase price variance, a usage variance, and a quantity variance. So first, for our price variance, that's simply taking, and I've got it color coded here where we can understand how we factor these different quantities out, and color-coded wise here. So for our price variance, that's simply looking at the actual quantity that we purchase here times the versus our actual price versus our budgeted price. So looking at our actual versus our flexible budget, the common factor here for our price variance would be the actual quantity we purchase, so we can factor that out here. And then the difference would be here, the variance itself would be the difference here between the actual price versus the budgeted price. So actual price, difference between the actual price and our budgeted price times some actual quantity that we purchased, that would be our price variance. And then for our usage variance, that's simply, again, looking at our flexible budget here versus our actual budget here. And this is where we're going to determine the actual quantity used. So what's common between the flexible and the actual budget here is the actual quantity used. We can factor that out here, and then again, it's just the difference between the actual price and the budgeted price. That difference times the actual quantity used. So that's our usage variance. Usage and price variance, we're really just comparing our actual versus our flexible budgeted amount. Okay, so for our quantity variance, that's looking at our flexible versus our static budget or our standard amount here. And what is the common factor here that we can factor out would be the budgeted price. That's the same. We share that in common between the flexible and the static amount. So factoring that out, we take our actual quantity used here versus the budgeted quantity allowed. So actual quantity used and the difference between the actual quantity used and our budgeted quantity allowed times the budgeted price, common factor here. That's going to give us our quantity variance. Okay, so let's go down and let's look at in graph form here. So I've got this graph laid out here, and along our x-axis or our bottom axis, this is going to be the quantity of direct materials that we purchase or use here, and along the y-axis or moving up and down here, that's the direct material cost here. So the other thing that we have on this graph here is this green line I'm showing it, and really that's a flexible budgeted amount here, and that's really we're taking the budgeted price times some quantity, and that's really coming off our different budgets here, but it's going to be a budgeted price times some quantity. And really we have three different points that we're looking at it, and we'll relate it back to our table here. So we're going to have our budgeted quantity allowed here for the period, and that we're getting off our static budget up here. Then we're going to have the actual quantity used and also our actual quantity purchased and that's coming off our actual results here for the period. And then what we have here along our y-axis, or our costing axis here, we're working off this flexible budget line here, or budgeted line of the budgeted price times those different quantities that we're dealing with here. So working off that budget or flexible budgeted line, it really have three different points here. That was the budgeted quantity allowed for the period here, the actual quantity used, and then the actual quantity purchased. So tracking those over to our costing line here, the first thing we have here based on our budgeted quantity allowed here is based on the budgeted price. So that comes off our static budget up here. And then our next point here is the actual quantity used times the budgeted price. That comes off our flexible budget up here. Okay. And then we have the actual quantity purchased here times some budgeted price. That's also coming off our flexible budget. And then we have one last point here. This is going to be the actual price times some actual quantity purchased here. And that is coming off our actual results here for the period. That's off our actual results. And you're going to notice here that is not lying on our flexible budgeted line, or that budgeted price, because in this case the actual price here is different than the budgeted price. I'm showing everything as unfavorable here essentially. So the only point is the actual price is different from the budgeted price, so it's above the line here. Okay, so what we're talking about here, just looking at this graph, we're going to be able to determine our direct material price variance and quantity variance here. And first thing we want to note here, our total variance is the difference between our budgeted price and the budgeted quantity allowed versus the actual price and our actual quantity purchased. And we've got that up here. That total overall budget variance here is our actual amount here, the actual quantity purchased times the actual price versus the static amount, or a standard amount, budgeted quantity allowed versus the budgeted price. That's our total variance. And that's the difference between the actual versus the static amount here. And then let's look at the direct material. First, let's look at the direct material price variance, because that's what we're dealing with in this graph here. Based on the quantity purchased here, this price variance based on the quantity purchased, the AQP here. So that's what we're dealing with, this actual quantity purchased on this particular graph here. So let's just see, where were we here? That was our direct material price variance. That was looking at this point, the actual quantity purchased times the actual price. That's coming off our actual amount up here, or we could factor it out here, versus the budgeted price times the actual quantity purchased here. Okay, so that was our direct material price variance, and we're getting that from the price variance here. We factored out the actual price versus the budgeted price times the actual quantity purchased. So we're showing that here, and those points here, those points right here. Okay, so now we come up to the direct material quantity variance. So that is really our quantity variance, again, is just the actual quantity used versus the budgeted quantity allowed, that difference times the budgeted price. So here you come up to it on the graph here. This would be the budgeted price times the actual quantity used. That's coming off the flexible budget up here. And then we have the budgeted price times the budgeted quantity allowed. That's coming off our static amount up here. Okay, so that's how those are compared. But you can see what's going on here. Lay it out in the graph form. Work off your budgets or whatever between your actual, your flexible, and your static amounts. And then you can determine your different quantity variances. Just understanding it in graphical form here. Okay, costs along our y-axis here, direct material or quantities along our x-axis. And maybe we could just focus in on this one more time here, a little closer here, just so you can focus in on it. Okay, so we have three different points here, and they're all on this, really three different flexible budgeted amounts here. And it's this line, this green line here, represents some budgeted price times some quantity. And the quantities that we're talking about is the budgeted quantity allowed here based on our budget, the actual quantity used, and the actual quantity purchased here. And you just intersect with your line here, and then when you got those different points here on the line, you can go right across here onto your y-axis and determine your cost. And you can see here for in the case here of the actual quantity purchased, actual quantity used, and actual budgeted quantity allowed, I have all budgeted price here based on the budgeted amount. But the difference is with the actual quantity purchased times the actual price. That is sitting up here, and that I have shown here. And it, you know, it could be opposite. It could actually be below the line here, reflect the below the line, but then it would be a favorable variance. But I'm just showing it in this case here. But that is really what you're talking about here. Just lay them out here, come up with your different quantities you have for your budgeted, your actual used, actual price, go up to your line, move across here, and then match it up. In this case, all our costs here, first costs here for our quantities were based on our budgeted prices here, and then we had that last point up here for the actual price or the actual cost. Okay, so that's it. But the point we want to make here, this budgeted quantity allowed, I'm just showing that here. If anything beyond that, as far as quantities, that would be unfavorable. Anything that is, it's costing you more money here than you wanted. Anything on this side of it here is a favorable variance. Anything over here is unfavorable, and same matches up here. Anything unfavorable here, match up the line, and you go across here. So anything here above your budgeted price versus times your budgeted quantity allowed would be unfavorable here. So I guess we went through everything here on this graph here. Again, this was based on the quantity purchased here. Okay, so now let's move over to the other situation here. Now let's just look at it in terms of our usage or variance here based on, we looked at the price variance before, now let's look at just the usage and the variance here. Okay, same situation here. I got same graph as we had here, budgeted quantity allowed, actual quantity used, actual quantity purchased here, and we have those three different points. Again, same line, same slope here. And I didn't mention on the other one, the slope here is really the budgeted price. Change of y over the change of x is really the budgeted prices that everything is sitting here in the budgeted price. The only difference here is if we start looking at based on our quantity used here, instead of using the actual quantity purchased times the actual price, this is where we step down and we actually use the actual quantity used times the actual price on a per unit. Everything's on a per unit basis here. So what we, for our direct material usage variance, that would be the actual quantity used here versus the budgeted price or times the actual quantity used. So if we went up, maybe we ought to go up and look at our graph here. So for our usage variance, that's based on our actual quantity used here. So the difference between actual price and budgeted price times the actual quantity used. So that is our usage variance here, showing it over here on those paths. Same thing, actual price times the actual quantity used and budgeted price versus the actual quantity used. That amount here would be the usage variance. And then for direct material quantity variance, same as we had before here. Just looking at the difference here. Actual quantity used, the difference between actual quantity used and budgeted quantity allowed times the budgeted price. So that's our direct materials quantity variance here. Okay, so if I didn't mention that in our first graph, the direct materials quantity variance is really the same on both of our graphs here, based on quantity used or quantity purchased. The only difference was this direct material usage variance. And if we compared it to what we looked at before for the quantity purchased based on quantity purchased here, that we were taking off the actual price times the actual quantity purchased at this point here, and then we were taking it off this actual quantity purchased here on our flexible budget line that we've done here. But with our usage variance, we step down to our actual quantity used here to determine our direct material usage variance. Okay, so I guess we pretty much went through our different graphs here to look at in terms of laying it out on a graph. Just remember your direct materials costs are on this line here, or the cost is really some price times some quantity here, and on our x-axis here, those were the quantities of direct materials here. And then remember, we had our favorable and versus our unfavorable. We have some budgeted quantity allowed here, and if we use actually more than the budgeted amounts, either actual quantity used or actual quantity purchased, those would be unfavorable. And then you can just trace them right up to your budget line here, or your slope or your flexible budget line, those 3 different points. Move those points across right over to your y-axis here. And just make sure you get it matched up here to budgeted price versus actual prices here. So you'd have to do the multiplication here and you'd come up with those variances here. So direct material usage variance was difference between what? Actual price times some actual quantity used here. Budgeted price times some actual quantity used. That difference here, we're just looking at the actual quantity used. Now the purchase difference based on our amount purchased was the actual quantity purchased, and I've taken it off this graph here, but it would be the actual quantity purchased at the budgeted price here. But if we went back to the other graph, you'd see that point. Okay, so that'll pretty much summarize using graph form here to determine these price and usage and quantity variances here for direct materials.